Now, I could keep going through and keep adding keyframes this way, but you can also copy and paste keyframes. And the sooner you learn sort of fast tricks in animation, the more you're using the computer to your advantage. So I'm going to select these two keyframes and copy them by hitting Command C. So they're both highlighted, so they're both copied right now. Now I'm going to move ahead another 15 frames and hit Command V to paste it. And it will paste that first keyframe wherever your playhead is. So now if I scrub through it, it's going up and then back down. And I can do this again. So I move my playhead again, ahead 15 frames or so, and Command V to paste it. So here I have a nice little ball bounce. If you're not comfortable with commanding and pasting yet, you can certainly move ahead 15 frames and practice clicking and dragging it. But it's best practice to use the copy and pasting technique as soon as you get comfortable with it. Now you can also navigate between these keyframes. So I can try to move my playhead right over one, and you can see when I'm right over a keyframe, this little keyframe icon here turns yellow. And if I'm not on a keyframe, there's no keyframe there. But you can also jump from keyframe to keyframe by using these arrows. So I can jump ahead to the next keyframe or jump back to previous keyframes. And this becomes really handy later when you have more complex animations, and I'll show you more about this later. But at any rate, there we have a ball bounce. So have your ball bounce a few times, maybe up to, I'll do one more, 3 seconds or so, and then save it. Alright, so pause this as you need to, and then come back when you're ready. I'm going to go to the time controls now and preview this. So your time controls sort of they do kind of what they look like they ought to do, which is play ahead to a frame, next frame, last frame, and so on. The really important one, though, is this RAM preview way on the side. Remember that one. So if you want to see what this looks like more or less as it would actually play, you want to click RAM preview. So to RAM preview this, I'm going to move my playhead to the very beginning and then click RAM preview. As it's doing that, you can see there's this green bar that appears, and that's how it's going to play. It's a little sort of slow bounce, but that's okay. As the green bar appears, this tells you that it's done a RAM rendering of this. So this is a fairly simple file, so it happens pretty quickly. If you have a really complex file with a lot of effects and stuff, it can take a lot longer. But this gets you the best estimate for that. And click off it again when you want it to stop RAM previewing. Once it's rendered, you can also press the space bar. Let's see if I can get the space bar going. Oh, I'll show you what I did in a minute. And it will show me that. Now just realize you can show the space bar anytime, but it might take a little longer and it might actually play a little slower than it would in real time. So that's pretty good. Now let's say I want to make this a little faster. There's an easier way to do this, but just for practicing's sake, I can actually move these keyframes closer to one another. So I'm going to select all these keyframes, and I'm just going to make them a little bit closer to one another. So I'm losing the sort of evenness that I had of that bounce. And of course, I probably should have figured out my pacing before I copied and pasted all those frames, but just realize that you can move keyframes around. The closer keyframes are together, the faster something plays. The farther apart they are, the slower it plays. So if I did a RAM preview now, that's how fast it would play. A much better speed. Okay, so go ahead and save. Getting used to pacing and timing and keyframes takes a little practice. So if this seems a little confusing now, don't worry, we're going to practice this a lot. All right. Now, there's also an issue of realism in a timeline. By the way, actually, before I come to realism, you notice that all of a sudden I had a little window pop up here. If you ever double click on a layer or double click on a layer in the timeline, it'll open up that layer in its own tab. And see up here at the top it says Layer 8-Ball. You can just click on the little X here to get rid of that. That happens to students a lot and they get sort of stuck. So just read the tab name. So we're in composition. Remember, this is the 8-ball composition icon. So we're in composition 8-ball right now. So if you ever accidentally double click on a layer, don't worry. You can just close out of it by clicking on the X icon. All right. So in a realistic ball bounce, when a ball hits the bottom, it squashes a little bit, and this is called squash and stretch. It's a basic principle in all forms of animation. So I'm going to zoom in even a little bit more. What I want to do is when it hits the bottom, I want it to squash down a little bit, and I'll even start with this keyframe right here. So at the very bottom, I want its shape to actually distort and squash out. The important thing with squashing is that the volume needs to stay the same. So however much you squash it out, squash it down, it needs to squash out the same amount. But I want it to be back to being round all the rest of the time except for that squash. So how do I do that? To do this, I need to bracket this form, and I'm going to animate the scale. So to do this, I first need to add a keyframe for scale. What I'm going to do is add a keyframe right before and right after it hits the ground, so that when it hits the ground, it squashes just for an instant. So I'm going to make a keyframe for scale. And this is one of those examples when it's helpful to see multiple parameters at once. So, you probably don't want to click just S because you want to see exactly where that keyframe is for the position when it hits the ground. And then I'm going to make another keyframe right after it. Now, remember, if I clicked on the stopwatch to make a keyframe, it'll delete that other keyframe I did. If you want to make a keyframe but you're not actually changing any parameters, all you have to do is click on this little icon right here. And then it adds a keyframe at that point, and I don't actually have to change anything. So nothing's changing in the scale yet. I'm just saying this is the point where the scale is going to be normal, and then somewhere in between is where I'm going to put the keyframe where it distorts. So now I want to be able to distort it, but scale, the height and the width are locked, and I need to actually distort it. So I'm going to click on that lock icon to unlink those two. Now I can squash out a little bit, 64%, and I'll squash down a little bit. So now, if I scrub through it slowly, you can see that it looks like it bounces. Let's do that again. Now again, typically I would copy and paste those frames, but I know this is a little complicated maybe, so I'm gonna do it one more time. So I'm gonna make a new keyframe. The position is symmetrical. It's 55%, 55%. So I'm going to make a new keyframe by clicking on the Add Keyframe at Current Timeline icon. Then I'll move right after that position keyframe and make another one by clicking on that icon. And then I'll go in between and distort it again. And this might be helpful to copy and paste that keyframe. So I'm going to select that keyframe and copy it, and then click on this guy and hit Command V, and I'll just change those numbers in the scale exactly to the numbers that were right here. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy those frames though and paste them. So I'll just move down the timeline and paste them. And I'll paste them at the beginning too, and I'll click and slide them. So you can actually have keyframes off your timeline that you wouldn't see. It's kind of weird thinking about that. But now at the very beginning, it looks like it was already bouncing. So if I save this, do a RAM preview, I can see it's looking like it's bouncing a little bit. All right. Now, let's go ahead and animate that shadow with this. So I'm going to unshy those layers and unshy the shadow, and then I'll reshy those other layers. Now in this case, and hopefully this video isn't getting too long for the web, in this case I want to actually animate the scale and the opacity of the shadow. Now I don't want to see all these individual keyframes, I just kind of want to know roughly where they are. If I click on this twirl arrow for transform, you can see that I have these little dots here, and they indicate where keyframes are. If that's too confusing, I could go to scale, and that would kind of show me where at least the squash is. So it helps to have some sort of indicator. But actually, I think maybe I'll do position. I'm typing P on my keyboard, and that shows me the top and bottom of the position. Now click down on the shadow. With the shadow, to add realism, as the ball goes up, the shadow is going to get a little bit bigger and a little bit less opaque. And then when the ball's at the bottom, it's going to be basically as it is. So at the very first keyframe, I'm going to add a keyframe for opacity because I'm going to animate that property. And then I'll also add a keyframe to scale. Then I'll jump ahead to this next keyframe. Now I could try to click and have them overlap, and these keyframes are close enough together that it jumps pretty quickly. But I can also use these arrows to help make sure that it's precisely over a certain point. So now I'm going to scale up that shadow a little bit, and I'm going to make it less opaque. So it looks sort of like that. That's not so bad. And then, once again, I can copy and paste these frames. Now you can actually copy and paste frames on multiple properties at once. So I'm going to copy those frames, and I'll jump to the next keyframe and paste them. And then paste them again. Paste them again. So again, whenever you can copy and paste keyframes, it's important to do so. It takes a little practice getting your head around it, but that's why I'm making you guys do a bouncing ball. By the time you're done doing a bouncing ball, you'll understand this a lot better. So now, if I press play, it's a little fast, but it's okay. So I'm going to save this, and when you're ready, move on to the next video.